Okay, panel, we're going to go in the sequence of the segments and give everybody a minute and a half maybe to give some key takeaways, summing up what you want to leave the audience with. So I'm going to start with Paul Cunningham. Paul, some key takeaways, please.
Well, there are two that I'd like to leave. One is take away the carrot. We don't really need public money to be misdirected to beneficiaries who can pay for public infrastructure. The second is that government money is not cheaper than private money. A huge cost, which economists, and I'm overgeneralizing here, would call deadweight loss, is incurred when public money is secured through taxation. And that loss is measurable by the difference between what the government can borrow money for, having assured supply of resources to pay the loan back, and what the private sector can borrow money for, and the same is true for equity. So we don't really need to pay that cost, where the beneficiaries can pay the cost. I'll add a third point, which the other two speakers really brought to mind for me. P3s are a process, and the process is one of reducing risk and optimizing value. And anything that stands in the way of proper resource allocation is a public cost. I think the illustrations and the detail that were provided after my more general remarks show why it's so important to focus on optimizing the use of resources, public and private, for public purposes in the United States. There's no reason to pay more than is necessary. There's no reason for the taxpayer to take more risk than is necessary. And there's no reason to suffer delay and other things that occur when the government might not know what it's doing as well as a P3 contractor. So with that, thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul Cunningham. Tom Barlow, a minute for some key takeaways, please.
Yeah, just a few comments that build on what you've just heard. I guess the first thing I would say is that P3s do have a policy foundation, typically in any project, which should be determined before the transaction is commenced. Many of the failures that have been observed, certainly that I've seen, have been because that policy context was not developed in advance. And I say policy and not political or partisan. I say policy for the reasons that you've heard, that there are policy directives that are really post-political and post-partisan that should enter into the consideration. But to the extent there are political issues, it is important that those matters be sorted out so far as possible in advance of launching a transaction so that they don't affect its outcome and do not affect the pipeline of potential projects by making the jurisdiction less attractive to investors. Second point I would make is, as I think we've all indicated and we were trying to indicate, there is flexibility in this model to allow for unique circumstances to be accommodated. There are precedents and there are projects that can be looked to for guidance, which I'll come to in a minute, but there is flexibility in the model and in what is included in the risk transfer that allows us to develop solutions that are not one size fits all, but are adapted to the local circumstances, and that should be considered and should allow jurisdictions to walk before they run by choosing some projects, if they haven't already done so, that can be accomplished with success, which can be then the champion for future projects. Finally, though, there are best practices, and we highlighted a few of them, that do exist because of jurisdictions that have been there before. And as a result, we are not, when we go into a project, developing it necessarily from whole cloth, which should give the public sector decision makers confidence, and also they are readily accessible as precedents for starting point, and also something the industry understands to get the job done in terms of the transaction documentation and also the structuring for financing, in other words. So I would stress that there are best practices that are widely recognized, that can be learned, that can be accessed, and that should allow anyone who wishes to undertake this sort of initiative to have the tools to do so.
Thank you, Tom. John Suckney, a minute for some key takeaways, please.
What I would suggest is that this is going to sound like a plug for us, but it really isn't. Hire great professionals. The one thing I think that is somewhat clear is that this is a great tool. It has flexibility, all the good stuff, but there's also some pitfalls. So rather than try to learn those mistakes on your own and relearn some things that I've already known, hire a great team, whether it be us or be someone with some experience, because there are some lessons that you don't have to relearn. Because I think this, in order for this to continue to grow as a tool, we need much more success. I think we need many more people who can see the benefits of this firsthand, both in their communities or through doing it themselves. And I think the second thing would be that get creative. So New Jersey is not one of those states that has an expansive P3 law, but New Jersey is one of the states that is getting extremely creative with trying to cobble together what they can and doing that economic infrastructure that Paul referenced. So I think get creative and get the right team would probably be my best takeaway.